Welcome to Construct Tech TV. I am Peggy Smedley. Now, Western Pennsylvania in Pittsburgh began as an industrial hub for coal mining and steel production. But what's made it so spectacular today is that it has evolved from a city of steel to a city of technology. Now, just for the fun of it, I want you to journey back with me. Scottish immigrant Andrew Carnegie was the father of steel production. Along with Henry Clay Frick, the two formed the Carnegie Steel Company, which later became the United States Steel Corp. Now, this was a very prosperous time in Pittsburgh history. The Civil War also boosted the economy with increased iron demand. Now, through the mid-1950s, Pittsburgh accounted for nearly half of all the national steel output. Now, think of it like this. From this came the U.S. Steel Tower. Construction started in 1967, and it was completed in 1970. Now, standing as the tallest skyscraper in Pittsburgh, it is 841 feet tall with 64 floors above ground. And it still stands today as an icon of what the city was built on. Yep, steel. Still, the city faced really tough times in the 1970s and even the 80s when steel production all but disappeared. So the city needed to redefine itself, and it did, as a network of innovation. The generosity of folks like Andrew Carnegie have led to the Carnegie Library, the Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh, and the Carnegie Mellon University, which most of us know today. The Carnegie Mellon University created a project aimed at developing the most computer network campus in the world. This type of innovation has continued to help reinvent the city. Today, riverfront steel mills are mostly gone, but now new tech startups and university programs are making it a living testbed of innovation. Now, we will walk you through some of these programs on the show today. All of this blending of traditional steel infrastructure of the past with network systems of the future. Now, that's what we call a city connected Pittsburgh. With this segment, I'm so excited to kick off our first show featuring a smart, connected city. Now, we're going to begin this episode by interviewing experts within the city of Pittsburgh. So if you live there, you're going to love what we have to talk about. And even if you're not within the city of Pittsburgh, we have some great information that we're going to share with you. So I'm going to give you a little preview right now of what's coming. So we're going to speak with the city to take a deep dive into what it's doing for all of its citizens and even all of the businesses. And then we're going to talk to Carnegie Mellon University, who's going to join the conversation to talk about how a smart city really builds on all of its energy. In fact, the city's sustainability team and researchers at CMU are gathering real-time building and data on all of the buildings that they have. So this is to test, design, and develop a platform that tracks and measures energy usage and even air quality. So this will help policymakers understand how to maximize energy performance on all of its buildings. So it'll also help building operators, as you can imagine, understand the energy needs of a facility. So finally, think about this. Building occupants will have a greater, higher quality working environment. So what's truly interesting here is what I like, is that the city has a district energy initiative aimed at creating a more resilient, efficient, and sustainable city. Now, I think this is really cool because the result is a smarter, more efficient city overall. So stick around. You just might find some really great tips into how your construction firm can leverage all this great technology, but even more, how you can leverage BIM as well as play a critical role in building the infrastructure of the future today. But when I look at all the lineup that we have for you on today's show, I think there are 5 really interesting and significant trends that are beginning to emerge. Now, let me give them to you here right now. First is work zone safety. We can't say enough about that. Then there's energy and water conservation. How about worker shortage? We've got a lot of that. Innovation at the universities and the state of the critical infrastructure. So stick around, we've got a lot to talk about. First on Safety Zone, Brian Turmail of the AGC weighs in on a problem that spans the entire country, from LA all the way to Pittsburgh. Of the 800 companies surveyed, 39% experienced a vehicle crash in worker zones in the past year. Now, most of you know this. To make matters worse, accidents on highway construction projects are just getting worse. It's all on the rise. So what can you do to get your workers home safe and sound to all of their families at night? Well, Brian and I are going to address this subject in greater detail. Now, we're going to identify some of the technology that can help create all of our safer job sites. So safety on the job site must be foremost on all of our minds. So in my interview with Brian, we're going to give you some really great ideas and even some advice for you to keep in mind. Next, we will jump right into what's happening into the city of Pittsburgh. The city's Chief Resilience Officer, Grant Ervin, will join me to shed some light on energy and water conservation. So this is so vital today. The U.S. Energy Information Administration shows total world energy consumption will increase 28% between 2015 and 2040. That means world energy consumption is growing across the globe. As a result, cities need to be proactive and to look at technology and, in some cases, build new infrastructures to handle the growing and rapid demands. Now, we hear the president talking about needs of infrastructure all the time, and Pittsburgh has been very proactive and is one city that is doing something very innovative with technology. So I'm very excited to sit down with Grant Ervin as he gives me a peek behind the curtain at what is doing to integrate smart cities and even their buildings. The third big trend that we have all been witnessing and that you are all facing is worker shortage. And this is something we will be addressing all year long on Construct Tech TV. The Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that the construction workforce grew by 1.66%, if you can think about it, between January of 2017 and October of 2017. Comparatively, the industry grew by 2.1% in 2016. Nationally, that's equivalent to 113,000 jobs, new jobs actually, in 2017 compared to 144,000 in 2016. So what's really needed here? New tools and technologies to take the edge off of all of these workers? What do we really have to do? So on today's Got a Tool, this gal takes her husband to task, demonstrating a good old tool versus today's new impact wrenches. I guess you could say or that tool just put him to shame. Or, at very least, I demonstrate that the right tool improves efficiency and productivity at the job site. The fourth trend I'm going to share with you today is innovation that is coming out of universities. And I am so honored to have the opportunity to sit down with Carnegie Mellon University to learn more about what it is doing in conjunction with the city of Pittsburgh. I will sit down with Azizan Aziz about a new building energy diagnostic tool. We will identify how this innovation can help cities and construction companies just like all of you. We will also look at how we can educate the next generation on the technology in order to build these smart cities. And it is so important that we think about what lies ahead. Finally, we'll wrap up today's show by talking about the state of the critical infrastructure. And that's actually our word for the day. And I will give you a brief history lesson, and we will talk about President Trump's drive to invest in the critical infrastructure. And there's no better time to understand exactly what that means, who will be impacted, and what part you might play in building such things as roads, bridges, dams, waterways, and so much more. So in this segment, I would like to give my word to the wise for what these words mean for the construction industry. We have a great show for you planned today. So that's it for Dig in the Dirt. Too many lives are lost at the construction job site, especially on highway construction projects. AGC surveyed more than 800 road building construction firms across the country. And believe this, 39% had experienced a vehicle crash into their work zone this past year alone. How can we encourage motorists to slow down and create safer job sites for all of you workers? Can technologies lend a helping hand and keep workers safer? This is what I want to explore today here on this segment of the show. I'd like to identify how to make road projects a little bit safer with the help of technology. So to help me address all of this, I have a special guest with me today. He started his professional career teaching second grade, part of the Teach for America program. He also handled public affairs for the U.S. Department of Transportation. Today, he is the Vice President of Public Affairs and Strategic Initiatives at the AGC. I'm so excited to have Brian Turmail of the AGC join me today. Brian, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Peggy. I appreciate you having me on.
So, Brian, let's talk about this. Some of these numbers that we talk about in construction are pretty discouraging. In fact, I'm looking at some of them right now, and it says that firms that had experienced crashes, 18% resulted in construction worker injury, 44% resulted in driver or passenger injury, 6% resulted in worker fatality, 12% resulted in driver or passenger fatality. Tell me about these. These are pretty scary numbers when I think about this overall.
No, that's absolutely right. If you talk to any contractor that's involved in highway or transportation construction work, unfortunately, they all have a very similar story of having some kind of tragic accident take place at one or many of their job sites where a worker was injured, or in some awful cases, workers were killed, and frankly, what happens with even greater frequency is that the people driving their vehicles through these work zones, who are speeding, who aren't paying attention, who are distracted, who aren't as focused as they need to be in the changing environment of a work zone, are getting hurt, or they're getting killed, or they're hurting their passengers or killing their passengers. And we've been spending a lot of time really trying to impress upon people that you have to be very careful in a work zone. It's not like driving on a regular highway lane.
So what can we do? I mean, that's really important. We want people to be safe, but what are we really doing to encourage people to do the right things when they go through these work zones?
That's absolutely right. We've been involved, AGC of America has been involved for over a decade now with a coalition of groups that has really been pushing highway work zone safety. There is, of course, a Highway Work Zone Safety Week, but we feel like this is an issue that's year-round. So earlier this year, we launched a nationwide radio advertising campaign where we basically aired ads at the beginning of the summer driving season saying, hey, look, when you're going through a highway work zone, slow down, put the phone down, and pay attention. A lot of these stories that contractors have are someone got disoriented and ended up in the wrong lane and then went through an orange cone and hit a driver, or hit a worker. The other thing that we're doing is there was actually, as part of the most recent transportation law that was passed, the federal government should be spending money, investing money in putting in place what we call positive barriers, in real world terms, Jersey barriers, that separate workers from drivers in most work zones. And the federal government has actually dragged its feet on implementing that rule because they're worried about the cost. But our argument is you cannot put a price tag on the life or the safety of a construction worker or on the life or safety of a driver or their passenger.
That scares me that you're telling me people are worried about cost when it comes to people's lives. The cost of a life is way more than the idea of worrying about trying to save money. Isn't that what we're talking about?
Is exactly right. And only in Washington can you actually have people whose job it is to put a dollar figure on the value
You're
of a life
scaring me right
and
now.
make decisions about safety. But the other point that we've been making, some of the data that we talk about in those surveys that we put out every year on highway work zone safety, is that there's not just a cost in human terms, which should obviously be the main decision, but each one of those accidents causes significant delays to traffic, to construction schedules, damage to equipment. So if you absolutely have to do this in a financial decision making, you need to take into account the broader cost of a highway work zone accident, what it does to traffic, what it does to commerce, what it does to the cost of a construction project, in addition to this unspeakable damage that it's done to the lives of families and the health and safety of our workforce. And we're going to keep pushing in Washington for the feds to do their part. And in the meantime, contractors just don't wait for others to solve their problems. That's why we're out there really working to educate the driving public and make sure they understand that they've got skin in this game and that they're most likely to get hurt or killed in a work zone, and they need to be careful driving through one.
AGC does a really good job, and one of the things, not only trying to educate, but you guys spend a lot of time looking at technology, looking at the educational process from just in a whole different ways. What about technology? Are we doing enough to encourage the use of technology to play its part in this?
That's a great question, and there is a lot of exciting new technology that's now become available to improve the safety of highway work zones. And a lot of those have been developed by our member firms working with the tech sector because they're so committed to finding a way to make those work zones, those highway work zones, even safer. Among the things we've seen are essentially, if you will, like sort of, think of Mission Impossible and those lasers that Tom Cruise was trying to avoid, like laser beams that set up around the perimeter of a work zone. And if someone crosses that laser, every vest on every worker immediately starts to vibrate as a way to say, look up, look around, there's a car coming your way right now, get out of the way. The other thing that we've got is just sensing equipment, so that if there's a piece of equipment, a vehicle coming near you, it shakes your vest, it vibrates your helmet, so that you know to look up and look around. Because one of the things about highway work zones is they're loud. You're next to a highway, you're next to a big piece of yellow equipment. You may not hear that car coming in that you would if you were at a park on a Sunday, playing football with your kids. So we want to make sure that we've got every possible way to alert workers that a car's coming. The other thing that technology can help us is, it's a little Orwellian, but anyone who's using a cell phone when they drive through a work zone, if they regularly drive through a work zone, we know that they're passing through a work zone. So you can actually identify commuters whose commuting trips take them through a work zone, and then find a time when they're not driving to send them messages or alerts to their phone saying, hey, we know you're going to be going through I-95 later today, or we know you like to drive on I-95, and there's a work zone at mile 50. Please be careful, put this phone down, pay attention, and remember the speed limit's 35 or whatever the posted speed limit is, so that we can actually identify just the people going through that work zone on a regular basis and reach out to them and make that extra effort to say, hey, please be careful. It's your life. It's our folks' lives at risk here, and do the right thing.
I love the idea that you're thinking about those repeaters that go through that construction zone on a regular basis, because you have those regular commuters. But think about this from a bigger way. We talk about that driver distraction idea. Do we think we need more legislation? I mean, I know you're right there in Virginia, and that's where you guys are based, and you're right there in the heart of all of government, right? And thinking about that, do we want more legislation, or do we want to put more of the responsibility on the individual driver and say, look, let's not legislate this. Let's put more personal responsibility on each individual driver to start doing more of to keep our workers safe? Or do we have to think about legislation?
I think a lot of we could probably do a bit more at state legislative efforts. A number of our chapters have been involved in pushing back against efforts to almost decriminalize speeding or driving distracted through work zones. In North Carolina, our chapter had to fight back an effort to say, hey, we're only going to charge higher speeding tickets in work zones if you can prove there's a worker present. But even if you're not doing major construction, there's almost always a worker at a job site, even if they're just doing an inspection, or even if they're there picking up the barrels. So you don't really want to start peeling back those protections. So yes, on the legislative side, there's more that we can do to have proactive measures or to fight silly laws getting put in place. Driver education is absolutely vital and kind of the core of what we've been focused on, which is reminding drivers to be more alert and more careful. And the other thing is law enforcement. They generally are great partners with us. And obviously, you can't have a police officer at every highway work zone. But a number of states have begun putting in place speeding cameras randomly placed at highway work zones. And we've found those to be a particularly effective tool. And you get around having to deploy a state trooper at every work zone, which you know is not feasible. At the same time, you send a pretty loud and clear message. If you drive through this work zone and you're speeding, you're going to get a ticket in the mail, and then you're going to play the game of figuring out who was driving the car that day and who's writing the check for the ticket, right? So that's a great deterrent. That's a relatively low cost for the state, and one that sends a pretty clear message to drivers: hey, be careful. You got to absolutely slow down in those work zones. And so I guess really the answer to your question is yes, all of the above.
And you know what, Ken, I love having you on this. I mean, Brian, I love having you on the show talking about all these amazing things, because if we think about worker safety and we think about what we have to do in keeping our workers safe, that's the most things. Brian Turmail, I love having you with us. You're the Vice President of Public Affairs and Strategic Initiatives at AGC. Thank you so much for all your time today.
Hey, thanks for having me, and thanks for talking about what is a really important issue to the industry. So we appreciate it.
All right. Well, that's our Safety Zone for today. The City of Pittsburgh understands that data is the key to helping make cities smarter. It is leveraging technology in an innovative way to solve some of the city's key infrastructure challenges. This includes water, energy, and I think even a whole lot more. Here to chat with me today is the Chief Resilience Officer and Assistant Director for the Department of City Planning. Grant Ervin oversees the integration of sustainability and resilience into the city's services, programs, and policies. Grant, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So Grant, let's talk about what are some of the, I think, things that a city has to go through when you're looking at working on integrating some of the smart city things that you have to do into a building and overall, because there's a lot of challenges, I would think, in that.
Yeah, there is a lot of challenges in building smart technologies into buildings. We've had a host of activities that we've worked on here in the city of Pittsburgh, really kind of testing and deploying. And one of our key tactics has been to develop small pilot projects that allow us to both identify collaborators, but also get to learn a little bit more about the nuances of the technology as well as some of our internal systems, and how do we use that in order to solve problems and improve kind of our information as well as our decision-making tools.
So when you look at that, do you look at the entire infrastructure? Do you look at a city challenge in parts and pieces? How do you actually look at that when you're actually deciding to build some of that smart infrastructure or smart city buildings that you talk about?
Yeah, one of the key things that we've been able to do in the smart city space is to both think as systems, but also to think about specific targeted systems. So one example has been with building technologies. We here at the City of Pittsburgh, we have 300 buildings that are part of our overall portfolio of facilities. And when we started to devise smart city strategies, we thought that we could deploy something across the entire portfolio. But quickly we understood that we didn't have all the systems that we needed in all 300 facilities. So that allowed us to start to target. And in fact, we then focused on 5 facilities, and those 5 facilities became one facility, and one facility became one floor in our city hall. So you really have to identify kind of, both big picture, but where can you make a strategic and targeted intervention?
So when you look at that, looking at 300 was overwhelming. It's just like kind of when you're trying to construct a building, in that you have to really kind of tackle it one piece at a time. And so when you're looking at this and looking at the technology that goes into it and integrating all the partners involved in this, it's the same thing that we tell our construction companies here. You have to look at how you collaborate, how you put all the pieces together, and then you have to figure out how is that all going to work, and you're going to communicate with all the information within those buildings. Is that part of what you've had to look at, so when you think long term?
Yeah, definitely. And it has to happen both internally and externally. So internally for us, it's really been working with within and across different departments in the city. So for example, within our Office of Management Budget, our Department of Public Works, we've started to identify kind of key and targeted nodes in which we can make an intervention. But it's also been external for us, so working with university partners like Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh, to kind of our key research institutions here in the city, as well as kind of a growing and dynamic startup ecosystem that has been developing here in Pittsburgh around building technologies. So we've been able to integrate some of those startup firms through a program we call PGH Lab, which allows us to work with small startup contractors and integrate and test and deploy technology into our facilities operations.
So if you had to look also at like sustainability and energy management within these kind of buildings as well, because I would think that's got to be a big important part of everything that you're doing within these buildings for long-term sustainability as well.
That's how we came to the conversation, frankly, is so my prior role here, prior to becoming the Chief Resilience Officer, I was the city's sustainability manager. And we had started a department called the Department of Innovation and Performance, whose idea was to not just be your traditional IT department working on hardware and software applications, but also to integrate data around a sustainability mantra. So my role was to work with a lot of these companies and university partners to identify technologies that provide a sustainability solution, whether that's energy management or air quality or water systems management, and find ways in which we can improve the operations of building performance using these technologies.
So when you look at this and combining this all, is it all becoming a mobility part of it so that you're enhancing the community with your citizens and their businesses and all of this to be able to have information readily at their hands long term?
Well, a key piece, take our facilities, for example, you have to think about your stakeholders first. So in the case of some of our facilities improvement, we kind of broke those audiences into two buckets. One is the facility systems operators, so the technical team that is working on equipment each and every day. So our electricians, our facilities managers, how do we provide them with the information and tools to improve their decision making with the jobs that they do each and every day? But it's also about looking at our employees as well. So we've started to deploy a host of technology that focus on comfort and individual consumption patterns and things of that nature that start to allow people to improve their decisions with their daily work lives.
So do you have to look at this as all being network data information that you're gathering every day that you didn't have before? Is that the key piece to all of this?
One of the key lessons that we've learned is whether it's in the energy or transportation space, you have to have the backbone infrastructure of an information communications technology network. And without that type of infrastructure, it's very difficult, next to impossible, to deploy these types of intelligent systems. So at the very basic level, what we've started to do is to integrate these technologies into our rehabilitation of facilities and our budgeting practices. So it's really been kind of one of the key lessons that we're starting to share with other departments and our budget folks, for example.
So as you're rehabbing right now, as you're saying, you're going from where you thought was 30, you went down to 5, now you're down to 1. How long is the rehab going to take now that you think it's a process, right?
Yeah, it's a process, but what we've been able to do is to strategically look at those facilities where these types of interventions make the most sense. So, for example, of those 300 facilities, if you look at a concession stand or a salt dome or some other kind of warehousing facility, for example, within municipal operations, these are places where you have a pretty stable energy load and really don't need any type of detailed intelligence because you understand the baseline operations. Whereas an office facility or a 24/7 facility like a firehouse or a police station is a much more dynamic environment. So we've started to focus our efforts in those places where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck.
Well, I'd have to tell you, Grant Ervin, you are the Chief Resilience Officer and Assistant Director for the Department of City Planning of the City of Pittsburgh. Thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Well, that's our Innovation in Tech for today.
Thanks.
Welcome to Got a Tool. We all know the worker shortage is impacting the construction companies all across the country. AGC even says that 70% of contractors are having a hard time finding qualified craft workers to hire. Now we're talking about 70%. But think about this. What if the right tools and technology could help? I think there are many ways to address that. So we are going to be talking about that all year long on Construct Tech TV. But I wanted to narrow in today on one specific tool. Contractors working in plumbing, mechanical, concrete, and even masonry need tools that are easy to use. So this can help both improve speed and efficiency at the construction job site. And I have one new example that comes from DeWalt. Now this is the 20-volt max impact wrenches, and they're available in detent pin or hog ring anvil style. So I received this detent pin, and I thought we would put this tool to the test. So I wanted to compare it to the traditional hand wrench to see just how much time it would save your workers at the job site. So now let's take a look at how it compares. And the race is on. So as you can see, perhaps the right tool can help your construction worker be more efficient in 2018. And that's our Got a Tool for today. The City of Pittsburgh and researchers at Carnegie Mellon are working together to track and measure energy use. This will help make data-driven decisions. The initiative will create a more resilient, efficient, economic, and sustainable energy ecosystem for the city. So for today's Learn It, I've invited Carnegie Mellon University to discuss how it is involved in this initiative. Here to dive into all of the details with me is Azizan Aziz, Assistant Research Professor at the Center for Building Performance and Diagnostics in the School of Architecture at Carnegie Mellon University. Azizan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
So let's talk about what's happening right now. As cities kind of move towards, I think, this 21st century, I guess I'm really concerned about what are the biggest challenges we're talking about. We think about the construction industry, and we're talking about cities and communities, and I think I'm interested what the built environment. You and I were talking before we got on air about this built environment. What do we really think we need to, what do we need to think about all these bigger challenges, I guess, is the big question.
Okay, well, you know, one of the opportunities, I mean, there are challenges and there's also a huge opportunity. I mean, as we move forward, we talked a little bit before about digital fabrication, robotics construction, and so on. But you know, cities has a lot of existing buildings, and how do we manage those existing stocks? In addition to that, as technologies got developed and move forward, there's tons and tons of data that's available. So what I see the biggest challenge and opportunity is to harness all this data. And, you know, they could be indoor environmental quality data, they could be weather data, traffic patterns, they could be energy data, all the electricity, gas, water, all the resources that buildings use and the cities use. That could be used to help cities manage their portfolio better, to help people understand how cities stack up against one another, and to really, get people to be excited what they can learn and help be part of the, reducing the energy consumption and resource use consumption for communities and cities.
And that's a powerful thing that you say, looking at data, because I think a lot of companies in, whether it's construction companies, cities, everybody involved in this, when we talk about the built environment, don't really understand the power behind that data. Can you give me some examples? Because you talked about a lot of them. When we talk about this data, what does that really mean when you're interpreting all of this information?
Yeah. So there are so many things that are really, really basic. I mean, I always divide it into two parts. I mean, for example, one of the challenges, Peggy, I'm just going to move us back to where, what are the biggest challenge? I mean, there's tons and tons of data, and there's so many technology, as we all know. I mean, even our smartphone, they have different operating systems, and they don't want to talk to one another. Just think about buildings as the lighting systems, as the cooling, heating systems, as all the plug loads. And of course, they are made by different manufacturers. On top of that, within the lighting systems, if you have a huge building, a really, really large building, there are buildings that you just renovate the first floor, and you use an X lighting system, and then you renovated the second to the fifth floor, you use Y lighting system. Those kinds of companies, because of competitive edge, they do not talk to one another. So the challenge number one is how we can get that data onto a single portal, onto a single platform, so we can analyze it better. Okay, so that's a big challenge. The opportunity, when we get that data, I always identify as two parts. Number one, when we see it in a user-friendly, really engaging graphical representation, we can really understand what are the kind of things, the kind of things that we can do just to eliminate waste. Because, for example, if I just talk about, let's say, your facility there out in a suburb, Chicago, and if we see that data at night, and if it's only like an 8 to 6 operation and nobody works there during the weekend, if there's a lot of energy being used during the weekends and at night, we know there's something wrong. We shouldn't have our lights on. We shouldn't have our AC and heating systems on. Now, with artificial intelligence, people talk a lot about that in tracking XYZ. In building science, we use that to predict your energy consumption, not just for today, tomorrow, when it gets really cold, when it gets really hot. And on top of that, what we can do now, even do it not just individual buildings, to large scale, to a group of buildings, to whole cities, and so on. So that's what's really exciting.
That's powerful stuff. So is Carnegie Mellon helping cities and companies, construction firms, understand how to manage all of these resources that you just described?
Yes, definitely. I mean, we have been quite a partner with the cities of Pittsburgh. For example, Grant Ervin is a chief resiliency officer for the city of Pittsburgh. He actually has been working with us and with teams from Carnegie Mellon University to find out ways on how the city of Pittsburgh can optimize their operations. And then one of the big operations is, on top of the public schools, the transportation port authority, is the buildings themselves. So personally, my team, the Center for Building Performance and Diagnostic in the School of Architecture, work on how to help them manage their portfolio of 300 structures and 150 significant buildings to reduce the resource consumption through the data that's floating out there, pulling it together, and then helping them make decisions on what to do and also develop policies.
When you look at that, do you see now that's going to be a trend that is going to go on not from just one city? Every city is going to have to do that, because we're talking about how important this is going to be as we see lighting. I mean, we even see things like Li-Fi that's going to come into play, that what's going to be taking all this data, because we're going to be using so much of it going forward.
Completely. Because this is the new thing that the city is looking at. They're trying to replace all the street lights. As you see, some of them really use a lot of energy. And then everybody's changing it to LED lighting, which is it's as low as 1/10 to 1/20th of a typical lighting system with the same amount or even more light level. So that's amazing. That's incredible. But the opportunity with new technology this lighting system, this LED lighting system, it also enables, as you say, provide a Wi-Fi coverage within that area. It just doesn't light thing. It provides people with broadband and also has a whole bunch of sensors that we can pull. For example, temperature, occupancy, and even crime data. And I'm sure if you talk to Grant, he will mention more about that, but I'm not going to focus on that. But then the ability of getting that data from the street lights and from the buildings would enable me to help the city officials understand the performance of all the systems, of all the lighting, and then how much they're paying at real time, and also predict the consumption based on weather patterns, based on occupancy. We don't need to light all of that spaces at the same level when there's nobody there, for example. And when we have a big event at the city, then we can focus on the streets where we think that the event would be, when we have a parade for the Penguins, for example. So those are the kind of things that we can do with data these days.
Azizan, I know we're running out of time, but let me just ask you one quick question about building information modeling. That's so important in all the things what we're doing. How important do you see that with the trends that are going on?
Extremely. And what's really exciting, Peggy, I just want to talk about the future, building information modeling. We do that a lot with new building. When we talk about construction, we model the building, we do the simulation, we predict the performance of energy consumption, how it's going to look like, what kinds of things that are within the building. There's tons of these data, and it's object-oriented. You can tag it to all the manufacturers. And the most exciting thing, we use the same model now to operate the buildings. So once you do it for design and construction, use that same model to input data coming in, streaming in from all the things that we install to see if what we predict, all the simulation that we did, really stacks up against the data, whether the consumption is correct. So we can then measure that simulation against measured data. So that's the most exciting thing about the building information modeling.
Who would have thought all of these things would have happened in construction a few years ago, and how it's changing, right?
It's amazing. So that's what we do in universities. We have all those bright students cook up these new things. We do pilot studies, and then we test it out at federal agencies, at cities that are willing. Pittsburgh is fantastic. I'm sure Chicago is the same way. But yeah, getting demonstration partners and collaborators is so important rather than just being within the university itself. We want to test it out. We want to make sure. And then once we're done, we need to commercialize it so people can use it. So that's that model that we have.
I want to thank you so much again, Azizan Aziz, from the Assistant Research Professor at the Center of Building Performance and Diagnostics in the School of Architecture at Carnegie Mellon University. Thank you so much for being with us today. We really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you, Peggy, and for the opportunity to be here and talk with you about buildings and energy efficiency and environmental sustainability. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. All right, that's our Learn It for today. Today's word of the day is critical infrastructure. Now, it's a term we've all been hearing a lot about lately, and I wanted to dive into what this means on today's show. But first, let's take a look back. The term first emerged back in the 1990s. Many agencies became aware of the word after the Oklahoma City bombing and the omnibus counterterrorism attack of 1995. In 1996, then President Bill Clinton signed an executive order 13010. This defined the term critical infrastructures for the first time in official federal policy. Now, the executive order stated certain national infrastructures are so vital that their incapacity or destruction would have a debilitating impact on the defense of our economic security. So now let's think about this. Most critical infrastructure is privately owned and operated, and thus government and private sectors must have formed all these private partnerships to prevent and reduce risks of disruption. Now let's look at what these include. It's telecommunications, electrical power systems, gas and oil storage and transportation, banking and finance, transportation, we're talking about water supply systems, emergency services, and continuity of all the government. Now, threats to these critical infrastructures fall basically into two categories: physical threats to tangible property, or threats of electric and or computer attack. Now, mind you, this is always established before the days of 9/11. Much has changed since then. Current President Donald Trump says the nation's infrastructure is of utmost importance to revitalizing and protecting our country. Now, with that in mind, today the Department of Homeland Security says there are actually 16 critical infrastructure sectors that are considered vital to the United States. Now, let's go through them. There's chemical, commercial facilities, communications, critical manufacturing. Now, we have dams, we have defense, industrial base, we have emergency services, there's energy, financial services, food and agriculture, government facilities, healthcare and public health, information technology, nuclear reactors, materials and waste, transportation systems, water and wastewater systems. All of these services underpin America's backbone. They provide us with the power in our homes, water to drink, and transportation systems that actually move us. We rely on these systems to be secure and resilient in order to conduct business and live all of our daily lives. Specifically for the construction industry, President Trump is pushing regulatory reforms in an effort to spark growth and investment in infrastructure. The president has stated he seeks to reduce permitting time for infrastructure projects from 10 years to 2 years. And he is looking to spur private sector capital to rebuild cities and states. As part of the plan, the president has dedicated $200 billion in his budget for infrastructure, of which $1 trillion investment should be earmarked for the crumbling of roads, bridges, dams, and highways. Critical infrastructure. That is your word of the day. So make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And thanks for watching Construct Tech TV, where we are talking tech at the job site.